Where there is the good, there is also the bad, and such a principle applies to the releases of Genshin's units, as not every release has turned out exactly as people would have hoped. Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. She was one of the first new Inazuma characters to release alongside the brand new region, which was hype as all heck at the time. Everyone was ready to rumble. She seemed like a promising pyro DPS, so many were geared up and ready to pull for her. Lo and behold, she ended up having one of the lamest kits of all time with some irritating bugs to accompany. Her being single target only isn't really that much of an issue these days anymore, since the hardest content in the game only tends to feature a few targets at a time, but back when Abyss was split to have one AoE half and one single target half, she struggled a whole lot more. You couldn't really justify using her over stronger power units such as Hu Tao or Xiangling. Her DPS was pretty abysmal and some parts of her kit didn't even make that much sense together. Shimina was eating up energy while her burst gives everybody a 20% attack buff. Where was the logic in the kit design here? Constellations can't save her either, as she was given one of the worst high investment lineups in all of Genshin Impact. I know that the ceiling has drastically risen for cons over time, but characters older than Yoimiya still have lineups which still hold up in today's whale meta. For example, C6 Ganyu. There were some arrow issues at the time of her launch as well. Sometimes she would freaking miss her arrow shots. Yup. If the enemy moved a little too far, you wouldn't land your shot. How very fun. Over time, she did gain some major buffs with Yolan, and there was eventually Yunjin who could replace Bennett for you if you needed him on the other half. That was during a time where freeing up Bennett was considered to be incredibly crucial, as most DPSs were attack scalers back then. Yolan was huge for her to be fair, but she still wasn't all that impressive. Sadly, this is one of the characters on this list who never really evolved past being a mid-unit at best, and a bad one at worst. She was disappointing on release, and is serviceable at best in the current day. Next up, we have a zero-to-hero tale which is quite nice. Sangonomiya Kokomi. She started off as a disappointment. It was all a big fear of the unknown situation. What the heck was an HP scaling on-fielder who can't crit meant to do? Her kit was a radical departure from anything that we currently understood about Genshin's kits at the time. Also, to be frank, her damage wasn't all that impressive, so it made sense that people were confused as to why she was constructed in such a specific way. Things took a turn for the better when folks realized that you could just ignore the on-field part of her kit. Something that I'm seeing here is that it took quite a while for Genshin to actually nail down cohesive kit designs. You see a lot of old characters with weirdly contradictory features, such as Zhongli split scaling or Albedo's burst randomly only scaling off of attack. In this case, the only reason you'd ever use Kokomi's burst is to extend the field time of her jellyfish. That landed her a pretty nice place in freeze teams. From there, the fish continued to experience a neat success story. Dendro came out, she got Bloom Comps, which was a place where she excelled, Farina came out within the next patch cycle, and what do you know, she's a super comfortable character to use with her as a mono hydro driver. She had some of her neat little quirks too, like being a great 4-piece tenacity of the Millilith holder, or being great with an R5 TDDS. So sure, she had a disappointing launch. She was pretty whatever at the time when she came out, but it simply wasn't her time yet. I do wonder why Hoyo likes to release characters ahead of their time, if you will. You could make the argument that they can gatekeep the rerun, but in most cases they just run the character again when they become relevant. Strange. Speaking of ahead of their time, Yae Miko. Goodness, this character was another interesting one. She was actually quite hyped up over a long period of time, since she played a neat role in the Archon quest. Plus, she has a really good design. I don't make the rules. It feels like it was so long ago when people were saying Yae is a bad character, it's hard to imagine her as being bad these days because of how solid she is now. But alas, there was indeed an era in which people were heavily disappointed in her kit. This was for a few reasons. First off, her damage was super underwhelming for a 5-star. If you had a C6 Kujo Sara, you couldn't really justify using Yae with Raiden, because a Sara buffed Hyper Raiden was just stronger. Yae's field time was stupidly long too, so it was very difficult to fit her in anywhere, compared to Fischl, who essentially required 0 field time. You take away so much field time from your main DPS by setting up Yae. Being awkward to play and fit into teams weren't her only weak points. She had bugs in her kit too, mainly to do with weird targeting problems. Sometimes the turrets would zap completely random object, or C2, they would totally overshoot their target, so she wasn't even completely reliable to use either. Thankfully, this is another success story. Much like Kokomi, the character was simply released far ahead of her time. It turned out that it was honestly better to play her as a main DPS right from the get-go once Dendro came out, which made a whole lot more sense considering her field time. She became the strongest aggravate DPS for quite some time, pairing excellently with Fischl, who also received massive stonks from working with the Fox Lady. A4 procs, anyone? They covered for each other's weaknesses, and Nahida's eventual release only further solidified her position as a great electro carry. Even if I much prefer DPS Yae teams, that's not to say that her sub-DPS comps didn't get any better either. She's excellent for Greg teams, and you can do some funky things with her in Alhaitham spread comps. Her kit bugs did eventually get fixed. I believe there's still some funkiness that goes on with them, but it's much less worse than before. And while her strange gameplay rotation remains, she has teams where she can make the most of them. I'm personally glad that she ended up being good, since I quite like the character. I would say that Chloriandra dethroned her position as the best electro carry upon her release, but Yae's still a splendid option to this day. Alright, this next one is infamous. It was the straw that broke the camel's back for most people. While I would say that this character is nowhere near as bad as she used to be, her release was so abysmal that it left a permanent stain on her legacy. That's right, I'm talking about none other than Dehya, the unit where the best thing that came out of her release was her darn signature weapon. Beacon of the Reed Sea, our beloved. So here's the thing, Genshin does this funny little thing where they don't like to announce that a character is being added to the standard banner until they're about to come out. I suppose it's due to the fact that they need to confirm whether the unit is going to be limited or not. I don't know how far in advance they tend to make such decisions. Even so, the domino effect that occurred because of this was that everybody was excited for the potentially limited character Dehya. When she was first revealed alongside all of the other Sumeru characters, people only had good things to say about her. Plenty of hype swirled around this flaming lioness just as much as any other new Sumeru character around her. Dehya played a pretty active role in the Archon quests too. It's not like she was never present, in fact you could argue that she was fairly important to the overall cast. So she wasn't slapped in out of nowhere like Emily was. No shade to Emily, by the way, I love that unit's kit. Just using her as an example. So there was no reason not to be excited for Dehya. That all came crumbling when it was announced that she'd be a standard unit, and of course, when that kit of hers was revealed. To be honest, it's not like every Sumeru character was a winner. For instance, Sino has plenty of gameplay issues which influence him to this day, but Dehya was on a whole other level of cringe to play. Her kit made no real sense. There were random restrictions in place that made her feel clunkier for no reason, such as not being able to jump during her burst. We had better defensive options at the time, her damage was very low despite being an on-fielder during her burst, and Thoma continued to be a better unit than her in Pyrodendro-based teams. She proved that using 3 characters is better than using Dehya as a 4th and giving her any field time. This is one of the most famous tragedies in Genshin of all time. So much hype, all gone to waste. I imagine that there were plenty of people who were saving up since the start of Sumeru, only to get slapped in the face with a character that had an awful kit. It's crazy how even to this day, her reputation precedes her. The good news is that in this day and age, she's decent. Good? No, not really. But back then, you couldn't even make her work without it always being a detriment to your team. That's how bad she was. These days, you can actually make her work pretty well. For example, using her on Cinder City. She'll only give you 12% of the buff, but she still provides a buff nonetheless. Her unique pyro application is also pretty nice for modern Outlaw characters such as Mualani and Kenichi, both of which are good characters, especially the Shark Surfer who is shredding apart the scene right now. Her on-field playstyle unfortunately continues to have no uses. However, she is at the very least a useful character now. She went from being at the bottom of F tier to being a low B tier character in this current patch cycle. It's still a tragedy that she's worse than freaking Thoma. Well, Thoma's pretty good, but you get my point. I'm not really a Dehya fan, I don't care about her, but my goodness, I am sorry to all of you fans of her out there. Hopefully Not Long gave you the absolution that you were looking for with her. So a horribly tragic start, but it's a story that at least has a somewhat positive end. Easily the most famous disappointing kit of all time. Some might argue that Zhongli's case is even more famous. Essentially, he released early on in 1.1, so Genshin was still figuring out what would and wouldn't work in terms of kit design. So for their legendary Geo Archon, they released a fellow who had a shield that was really crappy against all non-Geo enemies. This infuriated the CN community. So much so that there was insane clamor until this was resolved. He got buffed and then became a truly Archon tier shielder. Unfortunately, Vortex Vanquisher never got buffed. That's still one of the most questionable weapons of all time. Even so, his actual kit got much better, so folks were satisfied after that. Q Zhongli being one of the most highly regarded Genshin characters of all time, with many still praising his ease of use to this day. It's a fairly simple story, but one that is worth mentioning due to the fame that it carries. Last and quite frankly least, we have Sigewinne. Right, so I honestly wasn't sure as to whether I should put her in this video or not. This video is about the most disappointing character releases of all time, but nobody really cared about Sigewinne in the first place. She should have been a dang 4-star. However, when talking about 5 stars that have horrendously random kits, this character has to be brought up. Weird Kit design. She has 3 seconds of field time, can generate source water droplets, has a useless Bond of Life passive, and for whatever reason is a 5-star character. Nobody cared about her then, and nobody cares about her now. I don't think she has 0 teams. You can still use her in Farina Monohydro or Farina official teams, and she has a passive which buffs pets. But otherwise, there is like 0 kit cohesion here. I don't know what Hoya was trying to cook here. Just goes to show that no matter how late we get into the game's life cycle, we'll still end up with some weird kits. There's not much else to add here, considering that she was one of the least hyped up characters in all of Fontaine. Unfortunately, there's no success story to speak of here. Perhaps later on, who knows? Her kit's kind of a mess, so I don't have much faith. The nice thing is that a majority of the characters that I've mentioned did have a brief period of success, or are successful in this current day and age. Sure, Yoimiya and Sigewinne got the short end of the stick, but at least all of the others are thriving. I do wonder if 5.5 is going to bring us another bad to mid release, as per the demands of the ancient curse of X.5. We'll see. What do you think about these? Did I miss out on a particularly grave release? Let's discuss all that down below in the comments. Also, for those who are uninformed, I've recently opened a ZZZ second channel. Go subscribe if you're interested in watching silly ZZZ content. Hopefully this video was able to tell you about the most disappointing launches in all of Genshin history. This has been Juice, signing out, and I'll see you all in Genshin 5.5 when they make a character who heals the enemies.